Um, so, we are pleased, we, the AAUP of Oakland University, are pleased to welcome Dr. Glinda Rawls today. Dr. Rawls is an associate professor at Western Michigan's Department of Counselor Education and Counseling Psychology. She earned a doctorate in counselor education and supervision from Western Michigan University, and her Master of Education degree in college student affairs leadership from Grand Valley University, and also a Master of Arts in Student Affairs in Higher Education from Western Michigan University. Dr. Rawls has years of clinical experience and as well as teaching experience, which can be evidenced through her research in a recent publication, Biotherapy and Group Counseling with African American College Students, a case study. She discusses how the use of innovative therapeutic interventions can enhance the college experience for African American students. Beyond her work at WMU, which is sort of how we got to know her, Dr. Rawls is very involved in the AAUP at the national level, serving both as a member of the National AAUP Council and as the National AAUP Racial Justice Committee Chair. The committee, first formed in 2020, seeks to better understand and address systematic racism within the association, including regional chapters and the organization. We are grateful she has joined us today and look forward to hearing both from her and from our members about how issues of racial justice and injustice impact us here in higher education and on the national and local levels. And so the title of Dr. Rawls's talk is The Assault on Critical Race Theory and Its Threats to Academic Freedom. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Rawls.
Thank you, Karen, for that introduction. I also would like to thank Allison, who was very instrumental in contacting me to do this presentation. I would also like to thank Amy Pollard, your chapter leader, for her leadership to the chapter. She's been also very helpful with coordinating efforts for this presentation. I would also like to thank your chapter leadership. I, as Karen mentioned, have been very involved in the WMU chapter of AAUP, and so I know how hard your chapter leaders work on your behalf. And then I also want to thank all of you for attending this workshop and taking time out of your busy schedules to hear me talk about critical race theory and its the attacks of critical race theory and its effect on academic freedom. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can start the PowerPoint presentation. As Karen mentioned, I'm going to talk about the attack on critical race theory and its threat to academic freedom. I'm going to talk a little bit about critical race theory, talk about some of the attacks on critical race theory, discuss academic freedom, because I believe this topic is really rooted in an assault and attack on academic freedom. And I'm also going to talk a little bit more about AAUP's national response to these attacks. But I also want to start with a quote. Many of you, as an academic, always want to, sometimes we always want to begin with a quote to set the context. And the quote says, "It appears that my worst fears have been realized. We have made progress in everything, yet nothing has changed." And that is from Derek Bell, and he was instrumental in developing critical race theory. But I wanted to provide some words and context for this presentation, because I feel like this quote is very central to critical race theory. And that if we don't teach the truth, we won't learn from our history. And sometimes our history has a hard and difficult path that we need to share with others. And if we don't share our truth and the truth about our history, then we can make all kinds of advances and still not move forward as a society. As I mentioned, Derek Bell is one of the founders of the critical race theory, as well as Alan David Freeman. He was a law professor at the University of Buffalo, and they both are attributed to developing critical race theory, which emerged in the 1970s at the same time that critical legal theory was developed. Now, I want to talk a little bit about critical legal theory because critical legal theory was a law, basically really kind of critique of a law. And it was a theory that states that law is necessarily intertwined with our social issues and that law has inherent biases, right? And critical legal theory really took an attack on law as being something that's objective, neutral, really started to critique, if you will, Lady Justice not being blind to certain issues. The critical legal theory also supports the interest and notion that the law was really developed and designed, and those who designed it or developed law benefit from it. So it really started to take this kind of critique. Critical legal theory really started to take this critique. Daryl Bell and some of the early developers of critical race theory really took some of the tenets and some of the thought and philosophy behind critical legal theory in the 70s and began to start to grapple with what is happening in our society post the civil rights movement. Why haven't we moved further as a society? We used the law to help dismantle certain things, particularly like the Brown versus Board of Education, which then really had a critical role in desegregating our society. Why aren't we advancing more? Why aren't we moving further? And Daryl Bell and a lot of the scholars was saying, well, there's something with this, and it could potentially be rooted in issues of race. And there came critical race theory. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the tenets of it, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some contextual things related to critical race theory, how it was developed, what was some of the underpinnings related to it, and when did this conversation start to emerge and happen in legal scholarship. In the 1980s and the 90s, you saw critical race theory gain more prominence in legal scholarship. And I want to highlight the 1990s because we're right now sitting with the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Jackson Brown. And one of the things that people probably don't realize is that there was a nominee back in the 90s. Her name was Lonnie Grenier, and she too was developing scholarship related to critical race theory. And that played a huge and critical role as to why she was not moved forward with her nomination as Supreme Court Justice. There were other important scholars related to critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw and Mari Masuda. Both of them were Derek Bell's former students. Both of them play critical roles in moving critical race theory in the legal scholarship and legal realms, and as well as Richard Delgado, who was a professor and faculty member at the University of Colorado. Critical race theory has 4 tenets, and those of us who have taught critical race theories in our courses understand the tenets and understand what this theory is all about. And so I want to go over the 4 tenets of critical race theory. One of the tenets is that racism is an essential element of American culture. again, as Derek Bell and Alan Freeman was trying to figure out what's happening, why haven't we moved forward as a society with regard to race, and could legal law be a part of this? They start to say that racism is a central aspect of our culture. It's built in, it was designed that way. The other thing that we notice is that if you look at racial hierarchy, then the second tenet is looking at white over Black involves not only a material social relations, but also has an immersed ideological presence in society, almost like the air we breathe. It's so embedded and noticeable that it's a part of the way our society runs and functions. The third tenet is that racism as a social construct where individuals are limited in their free agency because they're bound in part by their particular social class. This particular tenet is where Kimberly Crenshaw really gained her prominence. A lot of times we talk very casually about this term called intersectionality, but oftentimes we don't understand that it is also attributed to critical race theory, and also it was Kimberly Crenshaw that really used this third tenet of the theory to talk about that it's not just race, it really is aspects of social identity related to gender and class and sexual orientation that may also be part of some barriers that individuals face from advancements. And so Kimberly Crenshaw really kind of coined the phrase intersectionality, but it really came out of this kind of third tenet of critical race theory. The fourth tenet is law is an important glue that legitimizes hierarchy of race, class, and gender and inequality. Remember, critical race theory is a critique of the law and its critique. And in some parts of that critique, it really suggests how much is law also contributing to some of our concerns with society, and really trying to really write in a legal way about kind of addressing some of their concerns. As I talked about before, critical race theory is a theory that looks at law and recognizes that racism is a part of a core of American history. Critical race theory is predominantly discussed within legal scholarship. Books have been written about critical race theory. And in fact, Richard Delgado's contribution to the critical race theory is he talked about the idea of narratives. And the more that we tell our stories about how race is affecting our lives, the more that we're able to use those experiences as a way to understand what's really happening with regard to race. Critical race theory is predominantly taught within post-secondary environments, despite what we hear in the media, despite what we hear from political leaders. Critical race theory is predominantly taught in secondary environments, law schools, higher education. And what we also have found since the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, and so we also found that critical race theory has been used to talk about race and racism in other disciplines in higher education. Education is looking at critical race theory, sociology is looking at critical race theory, counseling, my profession and discipline, as well as psychology, political science, you name it. Any discipline that really wants to have a conversation about race and racism have found the critical race theory is a great theory to use to talk about race and racism in a way that also further critiques our society. And so I want to move the discussion after giving a really brief kind of overview of some historical highlights, some premise and tenets about critical race theory. I want to also talk a little bit about present day, some of the attacks on critical race theory and what we understand and see in the media about critical race theory.
Some of you may be wondering, what's the deal with the GOP freak out over critical race theory? It's everywhere and was even used as a GOP call to arms at a conservative Christian conference last week.
The old Marxism used economics to gain control. The new Marxism uses identity politics. And the result is something that looks nothing like America. There's no reason to believe that this new Marxism will result in anything but what the old Marxism resulted in.
Critical race theory is racism, pure and simple. And it should be rejected by every American of every race. And let me tell you right now, critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
Okay, but here's the thing. None of this is random. This is the result of a highly manufactured strategy created by seasoned political operatives looking for the perfect wedge issue to take back power. Something to combat the energy of the multiracial coalition that took Georgia, and something to replace Blue Lives Matter, since January 6th exposed that slogan as a sham. Conservatives in Congress took note and started chattering, which was then ingested into the feeder system of Fox News. The tagline disseminated, and the war against critical race theory took off. No one wants a boogeyman near their kids, and certainly not in their classrooms. The operatives know this. Those fears got played up, and now, along with the fear of trans kids taking over junior high handball, parents are fighting with school boards in cities and towns across the country over curricula that they believe teaches white kids that they are racist. None of this is actually happening. But who cares about a little old thing like the truth when you have the perfect campaign buzzword for 2022? It even has the magic word in it, race. Joining me now is Kimberly Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, and the legal scholar who coined the term critical race theory. So it is your fault, madame. I tripped over the curb this morning and I went, critical race theory? Damn you! You tripped me on the curb. It did it. It does everything bad. I mean, and the cicadas, y'all really need to stop with the cicadas critical race theory. That was not nice.
We can throw everything in the bag. Everything in the bag.
So I just wrote down a few of the notes of what people are calling critical race theory: Marxism, racism, bigoted. Let's start with the Marxism. That's their favorite one. They're using that every single time. And I hate to ask dumb questions, so please don't think that I'm dumb. Is critical race theory Marxism?
Look, you know what? Here's the thing, Joy. Critical race theory is not so much a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's a way of looking at race. It's a way of looking at why, after so many decades, centuries, actually, since the emancipation, we have patterns of inequality that are enduring. They are stubborn. And the point of critical race theory originally was to think and talk about how law contributed to the subordinate status of African Americans, of indigenous people, and of an entire group of people who were coming to our shores from Asia. And the point was, quite frankly, to understand the problem in order to intervene in it, to understand why the greatest hopes for our republic were not being realized, even though these hopes were encoded in law. So critical race theory just inherits the beliefs and the hopes of Frederick Douglass, of Martin Luther King, who basically want the law to do for the freed people what the law did for enslavers. And we picked that up in the 70s and 80s after the civil rights movement to say, okay, so now we've had this big civil rights movement. We have all these laws in the books, but things really aren't looking as different as they should if we are really the society that we say we are. So we put about the task of understanding how law wasn't just the neutral referee. Law wasn't always on our side. In fact, law was less on our side than on our side. And we wanted to tell these stories in order to do better with the promises that are embedded in the Constitution. That's what's in critical race theory.
So is critical race theory, is there a K through 12 curriculum that right now is being taught? I'm sorry, I know it's a dumb question, but is there a K through 12 curriculum on critical race theory that's being taught in schools around this country?
Well, look, Joy, if it was news to most Americans that critical race theory was in K through 12, it was news to me too. I'm one of the co-authors of one of the few books on critical race theory. I think I would know if we were being taught in K through 12. I mean, basically critical race theory, classic critical race theory is a law school course. And it's really, not taught as widely as I would hope it would.
Yeah.
But here's the deal. This is not about whether anything called critical race theory is in K through 12. What they're calling critical race theory doesn't exist anyway. It is a backlash effort to reverse the racial reckoning unlike any we've seen in our lifetime. And as you pointed out at the beginning, they can't say, we're for racism. They can't say Derek Chauvin should have killed George Floyd with his hand in his pocket, looking like he was completely without a care in the world. They couldn't say that. So they looked around and found a strange sounding theory that they could put all of the grievances and resentments in and mobilize people around this boogeyman. And if our side can't really understand what's going on, it's going to work. It's worked in the past. It worked to end Reconstruction, and it can work to end this reckoning too.
And a gentleman named Christopher Rufo, who's very vigorously requested to be on the show, we're gonna take him up on it and let him come on this week and invite him on. He literally said, we've successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. To wit, Fox News has mentioned critical race theory nearly 1,300 times in the past 3.5 months. And we've now discovered that a lot of these parents that are showing up at school boards, inveighing against their children being taught that they're, racist, turns out they are actually Republican activists, not just regular old parents.
Big surprise there, right?
Yeah, it is not surprising at all. So I guess my last question to you would be, what do you worry is sort of the purpose of what they're trying to do? Because this is political. It is about getting out the white voters in 2022. Is there a bigger risk to naming critical race theory as some sort of Marxist plot?
Well, of course. I mean, the biggest risk is that this tried and true framing of anti-racism as racist against white people is going to win again. It won at the end of the Civil War when civil rights were framed as reverse discrimination against white people. It won after Brown versus Board of Education when integration was framed as damaging white children. And it could win now if people don't wake up and have a sense of what's at stake. So yeah, you're going to hear all these stories, cherry pick stories. Turns out a lot of them were not verifiable that the other side is putting out there. You're not going to hear, and you should, what is happening with these bans. You're not going to hear that an essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates was the reason why a school teacher was fired. You're not going to hear about the affinity groups in colleges and universities and the programs, the educational programs that are being canceled. So we need to see materially what this is doing in order to weigh into this. If anyone was mobilized by last year, if anyone is concerned about what they saw on January 6th, then you are on our side with this and you need to get involved.
So one of the ways in which I think this video does a really good job of talking about and discussing are the ways that critical race theory has been under attack, right? The ways in which this critical race theory has been demonized, right? Called Marxist. The ways in which critical race theory has been distorted. I think that the video also did a good job of highlighting how almost anything that's related to race, LGBT issues, anything related to diversity, now becomes critical race theory. When we just learned a little bit more about the history of critical race theory, what it was. Kimberly Crenshaw in this video also shared a lot about what it really was, a critique of law. But now it's become distorted and a buzzword for everything related to diversity, everything related to LGBTQ issues. And the other thing and the other way in which critical race theory has been used as a distraction, I think Kimberly Crenshaw also talked a little bit about that, distraction away from really dealing with racial issues in our country, a distraction away from really looking at telling truths and dismantling academic freedom. It really has been a distractor. But I would say that we in the higher education environment, those of us who are part of a union, we understand what attacks on academic freedom looks like. And from the national office, we believe that these attacks on critical race theory is ultimately an attack on academic freedom. So I want to switch the conversation to talk a little bit about academic freedom and what is it, why it's so important to protect, and why critical race theory and this conversation about critical race theory fits into that discussion and the intersection with academic freedom. I have another video. Oh, it doesn't want to. Let me see. I thought I had that fixed. So I may have to go. I may have to go here to play it.
Academic freedom is an often misunderstood and often contested concept, but at its essence, it's the freedom of research professionals, educators, to seek the truth, to follow their research, their teaching, their ideas, and to share them in order to pursue that truth, however it leads, assuming they're doing it according to professional and ethical standards. It's contested because sometimes asking questions can be sensitive or can be threatening to people who don't want to have their worldview changed or depend on a certain understanding of a certain topic or a certain question. And I think it's misunderstood because academic freedom isn't free expression, but it's connected to that. Academic expression isn't political by nature, but it connects to issues that are political. And because of those two, there's a lot of confusion about it. But at the end of the day, this space matters so much because the world is getting smaller. The issues that are affecting all of us are complex. And we really need to have an engine that can look at complex problems and try to solve them together. And that is what the university is, and that's what academic freedom gives us. I work with the Scholars at Risk Network, which is a global network of universities and administrators and staff and faculty and students who say, we share this vision of a university that serves the public good, that uses that freedom responsibly to engage with truth and difficult questions to try to help society. And our efforts at Scholars at Risk are to protect the space in which that can happen. And I mean the physical space, the bodies of scholars who suffer violence or coercion or prosecution or threats, as well as student leaders and so forth. But we also frankly mean the conceptual space, the space in all of our minds to think freely and not worry that when we try to ask questions or we share ideas that we're going to be harassed or targeted or lose our jobs or somehow threatened, not because of the quality of our ideas, but for the audacity of having them and sharing them. Different disciplines get attacked for different reasons sometimes. There's a, I think, very false and dangerous perception that there are safe disciplines and there are troublemaking disciplines. And I think this goes to a misperception about the definition and boundaries of academic freedom. Every discipline requires the ability to travel and engage and share ideas across borders, right? So we had a marine biologist from the Ukraine. He studied plankton, right? The tiny little stuff that some whales eat, right? And he was thrown in prison for it, right? Why was he thrown in prison for studying plankton? Because the data that he used to study plankton, he realized, and this was just after the Cold War, that the sonar beacons that were all over the ocean, the US and the Russians had all over the oceans to track submarines. He realized they were so sensitive that he could use them to track plankton flows, right? So this data was all publicly available. It was on the internet, but because the old mechanisms of the regime said anything from that is secret, even though it's on the internet, they prosecuted him for using that data, right? So marine biology was not safe in that sense.
So how does critiques on critical race theory affect academic freedom? As the presenter talked about, it denies scholars the ability to engage in truth-telling. We have to remember that critical race theory was a theory developed by our colleagues in the legal field, in the legal academics, and this scholarship is under attack. And part of it is because of the ability to understand race and racism and grapple with a very complex topic. But one of the attacks that one has on on academic freedom also suggests that the learner really doesn't have the opportunity to really grapple with some of these complex issues. Scholars have been under attack, as he mentioned, threats of violence as a result of academic freedoms and threats to academic freedom, and also have been denied prominent positions. Nicole Hannah-Jones and her 1619 project was probably a most recent example of denying a position related to scholarship. And we also see these educational gag orders, which really silence and censors academics related to their scholarship and their ability to teach. AAUP is having a national response, and we again really view this as an attack on academic freedom. And so some of the things that we're doing at the national level is tracking legislation that restrict teaching of history at state and federal level. You can go on the website. We're tracking all the state legislation, and you can literally see a map and all of the different bills that have been passed related to that, or is up for review in the House or state Senates. We're also putting together educational campaigns, webinars, toolkits to help. There is a webinar that was hosted back in December 2021. Another thing that we're doing is organizing. We believe in organizing at the grassroots. And so one of the things that we're doing is working with the African American Policy Forum, trying to have Faculty Senate develop resolutions about the importance of academic freedom. And if any chapter is having some challenges or difficulties with that, we suggest that you contact Jennifer Ruth, because she can also provide some assistance in helping chapters get those resolutions passed on campus. We also are developing statements. Our national president, Dr. Irene Movey, is also putting out statements, letting everyone know about our position on some of these issues. We're also tracking social media and media coverage. That information is also on the website. And we're tracking wins, both in Indiana, Georgia, and Virginia. Their state senates decided that they did not want to take up those bills. And then we're also supporting chapters who are involved in and engaged in litigation. I believe University of Oklahoma, their AAUP chapter has filed a lawsuit related to this bill. I think it was House Bill 1775, which would ban books such as A Raisin in the Sun and To Kill a Mockingbird will no longer be able to be taught in that state. And so we're also supporting our chapters related to those efforts. And I'll just open it up with questions and answers. I want to thank all of you for your time and your attention during this presentation, and I'll just open it up.
This is Shonda Scott. I'm a professor of organizational leadership here at Oakland. So I want to thank you for your work. I do think this is important. I do believe there seems to be more conversations that are against CRT than in support, especially in academia. So I'm especially proud of this presentation today, and thank you.
Shonda. I hope this conversation does start a discussion of what critical race theory really is. And there's a lot of distortion, misunderstanding. These are our scholars, our fellow colleagues who began as law professors, writing in journals, writing in books about this particular theory. And I think sometimes because of the political discussion, we forget that. We forget that this is scholarship. And that's another reason why we're concerned about this and its connection and relationship to academic freedom.
If I could just ask a question about the sort of national strategy that might be applied by the chapters. Is there a concerted effort to directly lobby with members of state legislatures? And I'm thinking in terms of those more personal contacts with members of the legislature to try to cut these efforts off before they get too far. Have we had any successes? You mentioned Oklahoma was making significant inroads, and I was sort of wondering what their strategy was.
You know, they actually, Oklahoma, their chapter actually filed a lawsuit. You know, I think what was interesting about the House bill from Oklahoma, as I understand it, is that it looped in public universities. And so what we have seen is that we know that there has been a lot of discussion and talk about putting bans and educational gag orders, but most of that has been at the K through 12 level. What made the House Bill 1775 and Oklahoma different is they lumped in colleges and universities. And I think that's what got the chapter there concerned, because then it really is an infringement on academic freedom. And I imagine that that's going to be their argument, that, you know, they're defending their academic freedom as faculty in Oklahoma to be able to teach whatever they want to teach. And so there are a number of different organizations. I believe Oklahoma, you know, free street speech organizations and other organizations are working with the chapter down there to help with them with this effort, because this was one that we saw related to lumping public universities into that. Many of the legislation that have been used, I think the other conversation I wanted to have is that critical race theory is not taught in K-12. That's a misunderstanding. I seriously doubt that we would try to critique law in elementary schools and in middle schools and in high schools. And so, but I think that's the way critical race theory has been distorted. It has been used to say that it's anything related to race and anything related to racism. And I think that Kimberly Crenshaw did a great job of really helping everyone understand that theory, and all of us who teach theory understand it for what it is. It's a lens, it's a way of looking at something, it's a way of understanding something. And that's what critical race theory is a way of understanding why progress has not been made, but more importantly, a critique of law. And I think that that's the part of it that does not often get addressed or talked about, is the premise behind these scholars and what they were doing and how it's not taught in K-12 education. But, you know, that's where the legislation is happening. That's where you see a lot of this happening is in K-12 legislatures. There is a huge control that that the K-12, the legislator has for the actual curriculum for K-12 education. And so I think that's another reason why we also see these legislative efforts happening more and more at K-12, because the legislatures have a lot more control over state controlled curriculum.
Go ahead, Todd.
Hi, just first want to say thank you for explaining what critical race theory is, because everybody complains about it in the media, and yet no one ever says what it is. They just complain about this thing and you just have no idea what it is. So I guess everyone just projects whatever they imagine the worst thing to be for them. But anyway, if critical race theory isn't taught in K through 12, do we care about laws that pertain to K through 12 then if it's irrelevant? Well, then that might be a very myopic question, because maybe what it would be is like, well, yeah, but then it goes to higher ed, and then, so I just was curious as what you might say to that.
Yes, that's a good question. I do think we should be concerned about it. We should be concerned about it for a number of different reasons. Part of what we talked about, and I think the other presenter talked about at Scholars at Risk, is this idea of the common good. And that's what the purpose of education. And I think, maybe we can have larger conversations and discussions about what the purpose of education is. But I think when we start to silence educators and we start to silence a profession, then the question becomes, do we still live in a democracy? And so that's our concern. And issues of common good, interest in educating for the common good, interest in being able to grapple with certain things is important. The other thing is that for those of you who teach race classes, and I don't know how many colleagues teach race classes, I do. I teach multicultural counseling, and we typically talk about race issues. And one of the things that I often find is that students from their, some of them from their undergrad experience, and some of them when they get into the graduate experience, have never had conversations about race or culture. And sometimes they feel very uncomfortable having these conversations. And we start thinking, well, why wasn't some of this taught in high school? Why wasn't some of this taught earlier? And so I do think that as we look at the post-secondary environment as a feeder from the secondary aspect, we want to provide those connections. So I do think that there are some concerns that we should have overall in terms of, really thinking about what are the implications of this for us and the kinds of students that we get and what they're able to understand and wrestle with once they come to us in the post-secondary environment.
Well, I also think too, getting back to Todd's point of view, a lot of faculty never had that preparation themselves. So it's really kind of hard for them to break that down to students, whether they're in the bachelor's or the PhD program. So to me, it looks like there needs to be some type of re-education for faculty as well, if we're really serious about moving this way. Because, a lot of faculty never had these race conversations in their academic preparation. So I see that as a problem.
Yes, it can be challenging. And I think talking about issues of race, it's not easy to have those conversations. It also is not easy to think about our history, the history of race in our country. And so you're right. I think there's some challenges all around when there could be some discomfort around talking about these issues. I agree. Diane, I did see your hand up as well. And
yes, thank you. I was in law school in the 80s when critical race theory was really hitting, and I was in Boston, so it was quite a big topic. And I think I was just thinking about something. I teach civil rights and liberties, and we were discussing Brown versus the Board of Education. And in 2007, there's an opinion in which Justice Roberts, when they were looking at how well the implementation of Brown versus Board of Education had been done, and Chief Justice Roberts says in the opinion, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. As if every time a law is discriminating based on race, and discrimination isn't necessarily a bad word. Legally, discrimination is you're making choices among things. But even the court has narrowed down this view of, discrimination to be, they have no nuance as to the fact that there may be times when discrimination is actually benign or affirmative action. It is meant to open up worlds, not to close them down. And I mean, I think part of that goes in with the Federalist Society, right? The Federalist Society, which has very much got a grip on our federal judiciary, including our Supreme Court right now, has never liked critical race theory because they believe it is, a direct blaming of white culture. And it's incredibly frustrating because I agree with most people have no understanding of the nuances of what critical race theory actually is. And two, I've always been frustrated with the myopic view that the court has actually adopted when looking at race now. I mean, they have narrowed it down to such a small world. And then I just wanted to close by saying, I also in law school, I'm almost afraid to say this out loud. In law school, I also studied, there's critical legal studies, there was critical race theory, and there's critical feminist theory, the femcrits, as we call them. And I also studied those, and I'm just waiting for that to become part of the package that the GOP throws around. They haven't mentioned it yet, to my knowledge, and I'm just waiting to see how long it takes them to get to the femcrits, to also use that as part of their weapon. So I'm not sure I asked a question. Those were just comments. Thank you for your presentation. I think it's been very thoughtful.
Thank you, Diane. And I agree with you. I think the points that I want to take from your comments is that, again, these are attacks, right? Attacks. And so, even you were saying, I'm just waiting for the next attack because these are scholars who really are challenging how we understand law, how we understand it from the perspective of diverse people, right? The feminist movement brings in gender and the discussion of gender. Critical race theory brings in the discussion. And we have to understand that a lot of this scholarship left us out, left certain groups out when it was developed. And so the idea is to also add these voices to literature. And so that's another reason why academic freedom is so important. And the threats to it also allows for silencing of certain voices related to how we understand law, how we understand race and racism. And there's not just one understanding of it. And we have to allow room for students to learn all of these different perspectives, and it's up for them to make that decision. But the higher education environment is the environment, as the scholar at risk speaker talked about. This is the environment where we have to grapple with some of these issues. It doesn't mean that we're going to always do it perfectly. It doesn't mean that we all will have the answer, but it does mean that this is the place where this happens. KMC Gary, I'll take your question.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Rawls. That was a wonderful presentation. Sorry, Karen. I have to change my name in there. And I think it's what I keep coming back to is this demonization, the distortion, the distraction. And the biggest part is the distraction. It seems what challengers, these especially the politicians that were in the video you shared, what they're adept at distracting. And I guess I come down like that messaging that it's not taught in K through 12 schools. So don't worry about it. It didn't work in Virginia, right? So that didn't work in that campaign. And I'm wondering if it's some of it is the messaging and trying to get ahead of the messaging as to, well, what's wrong with it? Because inherently it's not demonic, it's not distorted or a distraction. If anything, it's a long time coming in a conversation. So I'm not asking you to answer this. I think some of it is our messaging. Is that why are we not coming back with what's wrong with it?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, Karen, related to that it goes back to what Joy Reid talked about in terms of the inundation and indoctrination of what critical race theory is. So many people don't know what it is, and then they're looking to the news media to define it, and then that definition is, the 3Ds, it's demonizing. And so I think that's part of it is the lack of information and knowledge. And so I think that what we're trying to do through our webinars, through tracking at the national level is trying to educate folks and our members and our chapters about it. We also see this overall as a way to silence academics and a way to silence truth telling. And that is ultimately very scary when we live in a world such as in a country such as America, where we have fears about what we teach, when we have fears about what students can learn about, and when we have the government, right, shutting this down and creating, and I'm talking about state government or federal government, coming down and saying what we can and cannot teach. It's often, it's really sometimes the critique of Marxism, but then at the same time we get silenced, and how much of that is a part of control as well. And so I think this is a slippery slope with regard to what's happening and how we understand what's happening. But sometimes what's happening, how we understand it, it's really a matter of devices that are used to dismantle our freedom to be able to teach what we want to teach. And that's what we're concerned about as unions. That's what we're concerned about at the national office is being in a country where what we teach is legislated. That's what we're concerned about.
I think the one piece connected to that we haven't quite talked about is there's the silencing, there's the government, but one of the things that faculty are really concerned about is the financing, the money, right? So that if, we are in Michigan, you're facing lower enrollments, you're facing, I'm sure Western has the same situation with, austerity measures, et cetera, et cetera. So this notion of how do university faculty push back against something that might lead to reduced funding from the state government, that seems like a really important piece because money's always there.
And we see this again as a tool. Part of what we understand is that students come to the university for what we teach and our scholarship. And we shouldn't be in a situation where we then pick and choose what scholarship is available to students. The other thing is it goes back to what the scholar at risk talked about. There's no safe discipline. There's no safe, if we do this, we're not going to be at risk. We're all at risk. And we sometimes may not even know what that risk may be and how we may be targeted. A couple of years back, at one of the summer institutes, AAUP had a panel discussion of faculty that have been targeted because of their scholarship, sent hateful emails, sent death threats. So this is a serious issue. And the larger question becomes, how are we protected as a profession? Our scholarship and what we do as researchers and scholars should not be under attack. And we should also live in a society in America where we can study, learn, and research things that may be controversial, things that may be uncomfortable, and be able to be free to teach it. And that's the concern. If we look at this as a financial issue, we have to realize that students pay tuition to learn, and that is our enterprise. And that is what we provide as faculty. Francine? Thank you, Amy. Oh, you're muted, Francine.
Sorry. How are you? Thank you so much. It seems to me that critical race theory has really been hijacked. And it's been hijacked in a society, let's face it, it's very hard for people to keep two thoughts in their head at one time. And the GOP has decided that they're going to attach the boogeyman, the demonization, yada, 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 to it. And it is a question of academic freedom. It definitely is. It might not have reached the level other than in Oklahoma of higher education, but it's definitely reached the level of education in general. And it's only a matter of time before it comes up the food chain, it seems to me. Now, when I did not study critical race theory in law school, unfortunately, so I had to make myself educated about it because I didn't know. I kept hearing all of these things about it, but I knew it was in law school. I just didn't take it because I was more focused toward business. But educating folks is, I think, going to be critical about it. Forums like this, and I don't know, maybe going to schools or whatever, because people have a different ideology of what it is. And it has been demonized and it's continuing to be demonized, currently. So I don't know, I don't have the answer, but I certainly want to be on the right side of this. And I think the union is a good way to certainly to get all of us academics, aware and educated and all that. But how do we get other folks?
I think the awareness, I think you're right, Francine. I think talking more about it with your colleagues, with your neighbors, with your friends, really talking about what it is and the fact that you went to a presentation or you did your own homework or research on it. And I'm not quite sure if you're understanding, and I would use that language, I'm not quite sure if you're understanding it.
Okay.
And I understand it, right? And I think that we also have to come to the realization that this is a tool to dismantle academic freedom. And that is one of the things that really defines the very nature of an academic position. And so I think we're also very concerned about that, because what does this mean for tenure? What does this mean if you're denied tenure because of your scholarship? What does this mean if you're attacked or harassed based on your scholarship? Sometimes it goes way beyond critical race theory, although it is sitting with us right now. I think the scholars at risk talked about plankton or marine biology, or what's the next discipline that might suffer an attack such as this. And so we view it as an attack overall to academic freedom, which is the very foundation that tenure and promotion was founded on. That's the reason why we have tenure and promotion, or at least tenure, is to protect academic freedom. And so the two go hand in hand. And I think that that's the other part of this that we have to understand is, I think oftentimes we hear academic freedom as not being able to, I shouldn't have to be forced to do X, Y, and Z, right? And so I think sometimes we understand academic freedom in those realms, but I think sometimes we don't understand academic freedom as a protection so that we are able to teach what it is that we would like to teach and study and publish and research about as academics.
Well, I would agree, but then I'd also respectfully disagree in as much as tenure is under assault as well.
It is.
So-
It is. And, and I agree with you, Francine. And I think this is the other part of this that I think this is another avenue to dismantle it, right? I think this is another. So I think while we think that it's critical race theory, I think that this is maybe more of an organized strategy to also continue to attack academic freedom, which again will continue to have the attack on tenure. So I actually agree with you, Francine. I think that this is another strategy against tenure. I actually agree. I do. It's a strategy.
Well, we seem to have expired our time. And I want to thank you all for coming. Glinda Rawls, thank you very much for giving such a delightful, no, it's not delightful because it's really horrible subject matter, but this wonderful overview of CRT and the assaults on CRT and helping us to think about what all of this means and to think about how we need to respond as individual scholars, but also as a group. And so I would thank everyone for coming. And I would also just like to mention that if I encourage everyone to continue these conversations in your units. I think certainly in the School of Education, there's a direct impact in terms of, even if Michigan never bans critical race theory in higher ed, this is going to fundamentally affect your work. And so certainly I would encourage you to continue these conversations, but I would actually encourage all of us to think about what are the current threats to academic freedom? What are the current threats to the university as we know it? And this provides us with an opportunity to think about what we believe the university ought to be and how we can make the university what we think it ought to be. So thank you all for coming. And I hope you can take all of these ideas and move forward into your scholarly lives. And also I would like to point out that we are at the end of a term, not just at Oakland, but at Western. And please, everyone, I hope you have a smooth end of the term and we'll get a little bit of rest when it's all over, because I cannot imagine that you do not deserve it. So, and I don't know if you're looking at the chat, but we have all kinds of thank yous. We do have classes that begin at 6:30. So some folks had to leave a little bit early to get prepared and get ready to rock and roll for the nighttime classes. But so I thank you very much. And if you ever have any questions about this, please feel free to ask either Amy or me, and we will do our very best to help you out and move things forward.
Thank you all.